The Second World War was the largest conflict in history, filled with astonishing technology and colossal weapons of war. But the weapon that was most important to Allied victory as we know it was not the T-34 tank or B-17 bomber or even the atomic bomb, but a simple, cheap, mass-produced merchant ship. It was a ship that carried Allied troops and supplies to every corner of the globe, made it virtually impossible for Germany to win the Battle of the Atlantic, and brought Allied victory in the war a massive step closer. This is the story of the Liberty ship. The Liberty ship's origins were in the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most important battle of the Second World War. From the very first day of conflict between Britain and Germany to the eventual Allied victory there in the middle of 1943, the Atlantic was the scene of a 4-year life-or-death struggle that consumed vast amounts of resources and that at times was as close to defeat as the Western Allies came. It was a battle that started well for the German Navy, as its U-boat submarines enjoyed what became known as the First Happy Time from mid-1940. By the end of that year, more than 1,000 Allied merchant ships had been sunk globally, representing almost 4 million tons of shipping and massively outstripping British production. Hard-pressed to find the shipyard capacity to replace these losses, the British government soon realised it would need to look for new merchant ship construction elsewhere and turned to the United States. A shipbuilding mission was dispatched there in October 1940 in an effort to order new vessels from American yards. An initial deal for 60 US-designed Ocean-class ships was soon agreed, but the British officials had also brought with them a design for a new kind of easily produced, relatively quick cargo steamer. US shipbuilders were initially not keen to build such cheap and cheerful ships, but after the re-election of President Franklin Roosevelt in November 1940, the approach changed. Roosevelt declared before the end of 1940 that the US was to become the arsenal of democracy, and as such a huge increase in American shipbuilding was ordered early in 1941, with 20 new shipyards to be constructed and an emergency program of 200 merchant ships to be built as quickly as possible, to strengthen the United States' own merchant fleet and supply Britain with the shipping they needed. This urgency prompted a reappraisal of the kinds of merchant ships that should be built. It was realised that slick, sophisticated vessels must await better times, and that British thoughts of quantity rather than quality was the only possible answer in the circumstances. The British design was swiftly modified and put into production as what Roosevelt rather unhelpfully nicknamed the Ugly Ducklings, before Admiral Emery Land came up with the much more catchy Liberty ship. In the final design of the Liberty ship, every focus was given to making the ship as cheap and as quick to construct as possible, to maximise the number built in the shortest possible time. Large sections would be prefabricated and then welded together instead of riveted. The deck would be steel instead of wood, the anchor chains would be shortened, and only the minimum of heating and lighting would be installed. The ships would not be given radio direction finders, fire detectors, emergency generators, gyro compasses, or radios in their lifeboats. They would be incredibly basic, but able nonetheless to steam at 11 knots carrying a cargo of 7,000 tons, and there would be lots of them. Initially, Roosevelt ordered a 260 ship program, but as America's own entry into the war loomed closer, that target was revised upwards. Eventually, 18 different shipyards would take part in Liberty ship construction. The first completed example, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched on September 27, 1941 on what was dubbed Liberty Ship Day, and production only sped up from there. At the Fairfield shipyard in Baltimore, the first Liberty ship took 245 days to complete, the 20th just 120 days, and by the time they completed their 50th ship, production time was down to just 58 days, with a dozen ships a month being launched. On the West Coast, things were moving even quicker under the supervision of Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who was determined to produce the ships faster and faster. The average production time at Kaiser's Portland, Oregon yard was down to 47 days by its 36th vessel, and in October 1942 the yard turned out the SS Joseph E. Teal after just 10 days of construction. Not to be outdone, the next month Kaiser's yard in Richmond, California went one better, organising a huge effort to launch the Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours and 29 seconds after laying her keel. All of this production speed came at a cost though. The hasty production process combined with low temperatures and rough seas on typical convoy routes led to an alarming number of incidents involving the spontaneous cracking of Liberty ship hulls, beginning in 1942 and extending all the way to the end of the war. By late 1944, 558 US merchant ships had suffered some form of structural failure, of which 407 were Liberty ships. Some of these incidents took place in the relative safety of coastal waters, but others happened at sea with disastrous consequences. On November 7, 1942, the JLM Curry's hull cracked in two while part of convoy RA-53 and it had to be abandoned. Another catastrophic failure a year later caused fatalities when the John P. Gaines broke in half while travelling from the Aleutian Islands to Seattle, and 11 of her crew were lost. It was a problem all the way into 1944, taking dozens of Liberty ships out of commission at a time. But considering the scale of production by this stage, it hardly mattered. To put this next bit into context, between the years of 1922 and 1937, shipyards in the United States completed 2 new dry cargo ships, in total, not per year. Well before the Second World War began, the US government had begun to increase this number, beginning a program of 50 new ships a year in 1937 to provide 4.5 million tons of new merchant shipping by 1947. But as war in Europe loomed, these plans were soon revised upwards to 100 ships in 1939 and then 200 ships a year in August 1940. But even at this stage, still 92% of US-flagged merchant ships were more than 20 years old, having been constructed during the First World War. And then the Liberty ship came along. As the 20 new shipyards were steadily completed and the 160 slipways they contained brought into service, shipbuilding spiked. In July 1942, shipyards across the United States launched 12 new merchant ships. Just 2 months later, this number had risen to 93, including 67 Liberties. According to LA Sawyer and W.H. Mitchell, this was more than 1 million tons of shipping, which is nearly equivalent to Britain's entire annual output of merchant shipping in the whole of 1941. For the year as a whole, American shipyards added 8 million tons of merchant shipping to the pool, more than 7 times the figure from 1941, and enough to single-handedly cancel out every loss inflicted by German and Japanese interdiction during 1942. And they weren't done there. In 1943, the Liberty ship program reached its frankly absurd peak. The equivalent of 3 ships a day were launched for a total of 19.2 million tons of new merchant shipping, the majority of which were Liberties. This was, and I can't stress this enough, 41% of the total merchant ships built by the US between 1915 and 1945 in a single year. By the end of the war, the US had constructed 5,000 merchant ships, of which 2,710 were Liberty ships, making it easily the most ships ever built to a single design. It was a rate of production which made it virtually impossible for Germany to win the battle in the Atlantic, almost irrespective of how many U-boats it built or how bold their crews were. Total Liberty ship tonnage built was more than 29 million tons, almost a third more than the total Allied merchant tonnage lost globally up to May 1944, including the 2 and a bit years America was at peace. As the war progressed and more Allied shipping was required, Liberty ships formed the backbone of Allied convoys everywhere. The Allies extended their supply and logistic chains across the vastness of the Pacific, thanks to Liberty ships. They were able to deliver hundreds of thousands of troops and all their equipment to Europe and mount key amphibious invasions in Africa, Italy and France, thanks to Liberty ships. And they were able to funnel huge amounts of crucial Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union through Murmansk, Iran and Vladivostok, thanks to Liberty ships. Allied victory in the Second World War was built on its control of the world's seas and its ability to use that control to strike at the Axis with its full force wherever it chose. That ability relied on Liberty ships to move men and material across the world, bolstering the war economies of two great powers and driving the Allies towards victory one steady, 11-knot journey at a time. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's the last one of 2023 on Historigraph, so I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has watched, shared, commented, interacted in any way, and especially those on Patreon and YouTube members who have directly supported the creation of the content on this channel this year and over the last 6 years now, going all the way back to 2018. It's been a tougher year on YouTube trying to get sponsorships and that kind of thing this year, so the support given on Patreon is invaluable. So if you want to get early access to Historiograph videos, get behind the scenes update, and help to directly support the creation of this kind of history content on YouTube, please do check out the links in the description to see if you'd like to sign up as a Patreon or as a YouTube member if you prefer to do it on here. But other than that, thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great new year, and we'll see you in 2024 for more videos.